The time warp function in Mamba arguably makes Mamba worth the money all on its own. It's an optical flow-based retiming function that allows us to create smooth speed changes within our shots. There are two ways of accessing the time warp. We can either do it explicitly through the effects menu and time warp, in which case it becomes a node of its own, or alternatively we can do it at clip level, and we can do that by putting a clip inside a group. So I'm going to press G, and then a function of the group is that it can allow the contents of the group to be time warped. So under the group menu you can see there's a time warp function, and you can see a subtle difference in the color. If I just undo that, you can see a group G is dark green, and then as soon as I hit T to go to time warp, it's slightly lighter green. So as soon as this is set to time warp, under our curves we can see we've got time warp controls for the contents of this group. Now at the moment nothing's happening. The shot is running at its normal speed. So if I go to full screen playback, it does that. The reason it does that is we can see there's an animation curve there by default. And the curve is actually the time curve. So what this allows us to do is to chart an input frame to an output frame. So at the moment, if I were to park on, say, frame 35, we can see that what we're seeing is frame 35 of the input clip. In other words, there's no change. So if I were to delete this, we can now see that at any frame, I'm only looking at frame 0. So this is a quick way of creating a freeze frame, or any other frame that I want to freeze on. There are two competing ways of setting a speed change. One is the time graph, and one is the time speed graph. They're mutually exclusive, so use one or the other. So I'm just going to delete the time. So what time speed does is it allows us to set a particular speed. So for example, if I set this to 20%, our shot is now running at 20% of its normal speed. So the difference between those two curves is this one is explicitly mapping an input frame to an output frame, and this one rather is saying on any given frame how fast is the shot running in percentage. Now going back to the full screen playback, we can see that the slow-mo is not smooth, and that's because the mode I'm in at the moment, which is this nearest, simply means that it's repeating frames in order to make the shot last 5 times longer. There are 3 different modes for making speed changes: nearest, blend and warp. So moving on to blend, what blend does is it mixes frames together. So if I put a high number in here, we can see that actually now the result is that every individual frame that we look at is actually a mix of many frames. So with smaller values we can use this to help smooth out speed changes, and higher values like this we can use for effect. But the smoothest way normally of getting a speed change is to use the optical flow mode called warp. And what that does is it has Mamba track every single pixel in the image and work out where it's going to, what direction it's traveling in order to make intermediate frames. So if I switch to the warp version and hit play, you can see we're now getting a very smooth speed change, even down to the blink on her eye. It's possible in this mode we'll get some movement artifacts, particularly if the source image is very erratic or quick, so Mamba has trouble tracking where objects come from or go to. If that's the case, then under optical flow there are various parameters here we can change to try and minimize those artifacts. Smoothness, for example, is one of them. Remember that if we have artifacts in only one part of the frame, what we could do is duplicate this clip and have 2 different settings, one that works for the majority of the frame and one that best treats the area of artifacts, and then just use a shape to composite one over the other. The other 2 items in mode are display modes. If we put up vectors and give vectors a particular scale, what we can actually see is that Mamba is showing us the movement of all the pixels. You can see the vectors in there. And likewise on slopes, Mamba is using the RGB channels to explain the direction in which the pixels are traveling. So far, I've been setting Mamba to create a fixed speed, in this case 20%, but we could also use the curves to create profiled speed changes. So for example, sticking on auto key will start on the first frame and end on the first frame, and then in the middle we'll just go forward a bit to here. So now what I'm creating is a forward-backwards motion because I'm using the time curve. So at frame 10, it's actually showing somewhere between frame 7 and 8. Then by frame 30, it's got as far as frame 19, but then it starts to go backwards again. At frame 50, it's back down to frame 10. So if I set these curves to be smooth and flat, we should see pretty smooth speed changes. So even though this is ramping right down to minimal speed change, we can see it's still holding a nice smooth transition. And perhaps the most impressive thing is the speed. Given that I haven't pre-rendered any of this, this is doing this optical flow speed change on the fly.